What would you do if you met someone, spoke to them, saw them every day, only to later discover that according to official records, they had died years ago? Welcome to Story of the Black Past, a place where we uncover powerful and forgotten stories from history. Stories of mystery, hidden truths, and moments that leave more questions than answers. If you are new here, tell us in the comments where you are watching from, your city, your country, and the time you are watching this video. We always love to see how far our stories travel. If you have not yet subscribed, please subscribe and like this video. Your support helps us continue bringing these powerful stories to life. Thank you for being here. Now relax, avoid all distractions, and pay close attention. Watch until the very end, because the story you are about to hear is something you will not want to miss, even for a moment. Tonight, we travel to a quiet rural area in South Carolina, where an old house stood far from the main road. A house said to be over 200 years old, a place most people avoided, not because of what they saw, but because of what they felt when they passed near it. This is the story of a woman who lived there alone, or at least, that is what everyone believed. Her name was Margaret. She was known in the area, not closely, not personally, but enough. People had seen her, walking slowly near the edge of the property, standing on the porch in the early mornings, sometimes sitting still for long periods as if listening to something no one else could hear. She rarely spoke. When she did, her voice was calm, measured, almost distant. But there was nothing about her that seemed unnatural at first, just quiet, private, different. The house itself carried history, old wood, faded paint, windows that reflected more than they revealed. It had stood for generations, and people believed it held stories, but no one expected it to hold this one. Margaret had been there for years. At least that is what people assumed. No one remembered exactly when she arrived, and no one remembered her ever leaving. She was simply there, part of the place, part of the land, until one day something changed. A man from the nearby town had business related to the property, records, ownership, old documents that needed to be reviewed. He went to the local office, asked questions, looked through files, and that was when he found something strange. The name Margaret appeared in the records, but not in the way he expected. There was a death record, dated years earlier, the same name, the same property, the same description. At first, he thought it was a mistake, a common name, an error in the records, but the details matched too closely. The age, the location, even the description. Everything pointed to one conclusion. The woman living in that house should not have been alive. He did not speak of it immediately, not openly, because the idea itself felt unreasonable, but it stayed with him, quietly, until it became something he could not ignore. He returned to the house, not to confront, not to accuse, but to observe. Margaret was there, as always, standing on the porch, still, watching. He approached carefully, spoke to her, and she responded. Calm, normal, present. Nothing about the interaction suggested anything unusual. And yet, the record remained, unchanged, unexplained. The more he looked into it, the more certain it became. The woman he spoke to was listed as dead, years ago. Word began to spread, quietly at first, then more widely. People started to question, to remember, to reconsider what they had seen over the years, and small details began to stand out. The way she never aged, the way her routine never changed, the way she seemed untouched by time. These were things people had noticed, but never questioned. Until now. Because now there was a reason to question. And once a question begins, it does not easily stop. More records were checked, more documents reviewed, and each one pointed in the same direction. Margaret had died years ago, and yet she remained in that house, on that land, as if nothing had changed. The man returned again, this time with a different intention, not just to observe, but to understand. He approached the house, knocked, waited, and when the door opened, Margaret stood there, the same, unchanged, looking at him as if she already knew why he had come. He asked her directly, carefully, about the records, about the date, about what he had found. She listened, without interruption, without surprise. And then she spoke, not to explain, not to deny, but to say something simple, that not everything is recorded the way it happens, and not everything that ends truly disappears. Her words did not answer the question. They deepened it, because they suggested something else, something beyond records, beyond documentation, beyond what could be confirmed. The man left, without resolution, without clarity, only with the understanding that what he had discovered did not fit within what he knew. And that made it something else, something that could not be easily explained. As time passed, Margaret remained, the house remained, and the story remained, and not as fact, not as fiction, but as something in between, a mystery, one that could not be fully proven and could not be fully denied, because sometimes what exists does not depend on what is written, and sometimes what is written does not capture what truly exists. As this story begins to unfold further, one thing becomes clear. Not everything can be explained, and not everything that is seen fits into what is known. And once that realization takes hold, everything begins to feel different. Quietly, deeply, and permanently. The days that followed in that quiet part of South Carolina did not bring answers. They brought something else, attention, not loud, not public, but steady. People began to pass by the house more often, not close enough to be noticed, but close enough to see, to confirm for themselves. And each time the same thing happened. Margaret was there, standing, sitting, moving slowly across the same paths, always present, always unchanged. At first, some tried to explain it. They said the records must be wrong, that there had been a mistake, that perhaps it was another woman with the same name. But the more they looked, the less those explanations held, because everything pointed back to the same truth. The records were consistent, the dates matched, the details aligned, and still she remained. That contradiction began to grow, not just as a question, but as a feeling, something that settled in the minds of those who knew. Because when something cannot be explained, it does not disappear. It lingers. The man who had first discovered the record could not let it go. He returned again, not with documents this time, not with questions prepared, but with attention, careful, focused, watching what others might overlook. He stayed longer, observed more closely, and slowly he began to notice something. Not something obvious, but something subtle. Margaret did not move like others. Her movements were steady, consistent, almost patterned, as if time did not affect her in the same way. Days passed, and her routine did not change, not once. The same times, the same actions, the same stillness. And that was when the realization began to form, not fully, not clearly, but enough to shift his understanding, because people change, over time, through experience, through age, through small variations in behavior. But Margaret did not. She remained exactly as she had been, And that was not normal. He began to ask others, carefully, without leading them, without suggesting anything, just asking what they remembered. And their answers were the same. She had always been like that, always the same. No one could recall a difference. No one could point to a moment where she had changed. And that made everything heavier, because it meant the question was not recent. It had always been there, just unnoticed, just unexamined, until now. The house itself began to feel different to those who approached it, not because it had changed, but because their understanding had. They no longer saw it as just an old structure. They saw it as something holding something that did not fit within what they knew. The man decided to return one final time, not to question, not to confront, but to see, to stand in front of it and accept whatever he would find. He approached slowly. The air felt still, the kind of stillness that carries weight. Margaret was there, as always, standing at the doorway, looking at him. He did not speak immediately, and neither did she, because words no longer felt necessary. He already knew what the record said. He already knew what he had seen. And now he was standing between those two realities, and neither one gave way to the other. Finally, he asked one question, not about the records, not about death, but about time. Why she never changed, why she remained the same. Margaret looked at him for a long moment, and then she said something simple, that some things are not bound to time in the way people expect, that some things remain because they were never meant to leave. Her words did not explain. They revealed something else, that the question itself might be limited, that what he was trying to understand could not be measured in the way he was measuring it. And that realization stayed with him, because it shifted everything, not the facts, not the records, but his perception of them. As he left that day, he did not look back, not out of fear, but out of understanding, because he knew something now, not a clear answer, but a deeper truth, that not everything that exists can be explained, and not everything that ends is truly gone. Margaret remained, the house remained, and the mystery remained, not solved, not closed, but continuing, quietly, in that place, in that presence, in that space where what is known and what is real do not fully align. And once something like that is seen, it cannot be unseen. It becomes part of how everything else is understood. And that is where this story continues, not in answers, but in the questions that remain. And even as time continued to pass in that quiet part of South Carolina, the story did not fade. It settled deeper into the place itself. Because what had been discovered was not something that could be resolved. It could only be carried. The people who knew stopped trying to explain it, not because they had answers, but because they understood something else, that not everything is meant to be explained. Some things are meant to be witnessed, and then accepted as they are. Margaret remained, just as she always had, unchanged, unaffected, as if time moved around her but never touched her. The house remained as well, standing quietly, holding its place, not revealing anything more, but not hiding anything either, simply existing. The man who had first uncovered the records no longer returned as often, not because he had lost interest, but because he had reached a limit, a point where questioning no longer brought him closer to understanding, only deeper into uncertainty. And uncertainty, when it reaches that level, becomes something else, not confusion, but awareness, an awareness that what he was looking at did not belong to the same rules he had always known. That realization changed him, not visibly, but internally, Because once a person understands that not everything fits into what they know, they begin to see everything differently. The people in the area carried that same shift in the way they spoke about the house, in the way they passed it, in the way they chose not to approach too closely. Not out of fear, but out of respect for something they could not fully understand. Because there is a difference. Fear pushes away. Understanding creates distance. And what they felt was not fear. It was something quieter, something deeper. A recognition that they were witnessing something beyond explanation. Margaret never left, not once, not in any way that anyone could confirm. She remained where she had always been, as if her presence was tied to that place in a way that could not be separated. And over time, that became the only certainty. Not the records, not the questions, but the fact that she was there, always, unchanging, unmoving in the ways that mattered. As this story reaches its final reflection, one truth becomes clear. The mystery was never meant to be solved, because it was not created to be answered. It existed to reveal something else. That reality is not always limited to what can be recorded. That existence is not always defined by what can be proven, and that sometimes the most real things are the ones that cannot be explained at all. Margaret was one of those things, not a contradiction, not an error, but a presence, a quiet one, but undeniable. And that is where this story rests, not in conclusion, not in resolution, but in understanding, an understanding that remains, waiting for the next time something appears that does not fit, for the next moment where what is seen does not align with what is known. And when that moment comes, just like before, everything will feel different. Because once you have seen something that cannot be explained, you no longer see the world the same way again. That is the end. And that is why it continues. And even now, after everything has been told, there is still something that remains. Because this story does not end with Margaret. It does not end with the house in South Carolina. It does not end with the man who found the records. It continues, quietly, in the way people begin to think differently after hearing it. Because once a person accepts that not everything fits into what is known, something shifts, not outside, but inside. The boundaries of understanding begin to expand. The certainty that once felt solid begins to loosen. And in that space, something new appears. Possibility. Not the kind that gives answers, but the kind that allows questions to exist without needing to resolve them. That is what this story leaves behind. Not fear, not confusion, but awareness. An awareness that reality is not always limited to what can be written, recorded, or proven. Margaret becomes part of that awareness, not as a person alone, but as a symbol of something deeper. A reminder that presence does not always follow the rules people expect. That time does not always move in the same way for everything. And that existence is not always defined by beginnings and endings. The house remains, as it always has, standing in its place, unchanged, quiet, not revealing more, but not hiding anything either. Simply there, as it has always been, and Margaret remains with it, not as a mystery waiting to be solved, but as something that has already been seen, already been witnessed, already been accepted by those who understand. Because once something reaches that point, it no longer needs explanation. It simply is. As this story reaches its final continuation, there's nothing more to uncover, only something to carry. That the world is not always as fixed as it seems, that what is recorded is not always the full truth, and that sometimes what cannot be explained is not meant to be questioned endlessly. It is meant to be understood in a different way, a quieter way, a deeper way. Margaret exists in that space, between what is known and what is not, between what is recorded and what is real. And that is where she remains, not changing, not leaving, not fading, simply existing. And once something exists in that way, it becomes part of everything around it, part of how people see, part of how they think, part of how they understand the world. That is where this story truly lives, not in the past, but in the present, in the moment when someone hears it and begins to question what they thought they knew. And when that happens, just like before, something shifts, quietly, deeply, and completely. And once it shifts, there is no going back, only the realization that the world has always been more than it appears, and that some things were never meant to be fully explained, only experienced and remembered. And even now, beyond every ending, there is still something that refuses to settle, because this story was never meant to close. It was meant to stay with you, to sit quietly in your thoughts long after the words are gone. Because what happened in that old house in South Carolina was not just an event. It was a realization, a moment where something did not fit, and instead of forcing it to make sense, it remained as it was, unresolved, unchanged. And because of that, it became something powerful, because unresolved things do not disappear. They linger, they return, they reshape how you see everything else. That is what Margaret became. Not just a presence tied to a place, but a shift in perception, a quiet reminder that not everything follows the rules we expect. And once that reminder exists, it changes something, subtly, but permanently. The man who first discovered the truth in the records carried that change with him, not as fear, not as confusion, but as awareness, an awareness that what he knew was not complete, and that there were things beyond it. That awareness followed him into other places, into other moments, into every situation where something felt just slightly out of place. And each time, he did not dismiss it as quickly as before, because he had seen something once, and once is enough. The people in the area carried it too, even those who never spoke of it, because the house became more than a place. It became a point of reflection, a quiet marker of something that existed outside explanation. And once a place holds that kind of meaning, it changes how it is experienced, not just by those who know the story, but by anyone who feels its presence. As this story reaches its final continuation, there is nothing left to resolve, no final answer, no clear explanation, only something to understand, that the world is not always meant to be understood completely, that some things exist outside of explanation, not because they are impossible, but because they are beyond the way we try to define them. Margaret exists in that space, not as a mystery to be solved, but as a truth to be accepted, a quiet truth. That what we see is not always all that is there, and that what we cannot explain is not always something to fear. Sometimes it is simply something to acknowledge, to recognize, to carry, and to let exist as it is. That is where this story rests, not in answers, but in awareness, an awareness that continues, long after the story ends, long after the words fade, and long after the moment has passed. Because once something like this is seen, it does not leave. It becomes part of how you see everything else. And that is why this story never truly ends. It simply stays, quietly, waiting. For the next moment it will be felt again. And when it is, just like before, everything will seem just a little different. And you will know that not everything is meant to be explained. Some things are simply meant to exist. And even now, after everything has been carried this far, there is still one last, quiet layer that remains. Because what this story leaves behind is not just a mystery. It is a change in how you listen, how you observe, how you interpret the world around you. What happened in that old house in South Carolina was never loud. There were no sudden events, no dramatic signs, only something steady, consistent, unmoving in a way that did not match the flow of time. And that is what makes it stay. Because the mind expects change. It expects movement. It expects things to follow a pattern. But Margaret did not follow that pattern. She remained. And in remaining, she challenged everything that depended on time moving forward. That is the part that lingers, not what she said, not what was written, but what was seen. The stillness, the consistency, the quiet presence that did not shift. Because once you have seen something that does not change, you begin to question everything that does. That is where the story continues. Not in the house, not in the past, but in you, in the way you now notice small details, the way you pause when something feels slightly different, the way you remember that not everything fits into what you understand. That is the continuation, not of events, but of awareness. Because awareness, once it begins, does not stop. It expands, it deepens, it reshapes. The man who first uncovered the records carried that awareness, and now so do you. Because once something like this is shared, it does not remain where it started. It moves from one mind to another, quietly, without force, without effort. And in that movement, it grows. As this final continuation settles, there's nothing left to add, only something to leave with you. That the world is not always as fixed as it appears. That time is not always experienced in the same way by everything. And that presence is not always limited by what we can explain. Margaret remains, not just in that place, but in the idea she represents, a quiet disruption of certainty, a gentle reminder that there is more than what we can define. And once that reminder takes hold, everything begins to feel different, not dramatically, but subtly. And that subtle change is enough to shift perception, enough to open thought, enough to carry the story forward. That is where it lives now, not in the house, not in the records, but in the awareness it leaves behind, an awareness that continues, endlessly, quietly and completely. And once it begins, it never truly ends. And even now, beyond everything that has been said, there is still one final feeling that refuses to fade. Because this story was never meant to give you answers. It was meant to leave you with something else. A quiet awareness that follows you long after the words are gone. What happened in that house in South Carolina was not loud. It did not demand attention. It did not force itself to be understood. It simply existed. And that is what makes it powerful. Because things that exist without needing explanation have a way of staying, of returning, of appearing again in moments where everything seems normal, until it is not. That is what Margaret became. Not just a presence tied to a place, but a reminder. A quiet interruption in the way we understand time, life, and existence. Because once you accept that something like that can exist, even for a moment, something changes. The world no longer feels as fixed, as certain, as fully understood. And that change does not go away. It stays. In the background, in the way you pause, in the way you look twice at something that feels slightly off, in the way silence begins to carry meaning. That is where this story continues, not in events, but in perception, because perception shapes everything. And once perception shifts, everything else follows. Margaret does not need to move. She does not need to speak again, because what she represents has already been seen, already been understood in a way that does not require words. That is the final layer, not the mystery itself, but what the mystery does to you, how it changes the way you think, how it opens a space where certainty once existed, and how it leaves that space open. As this story finally comes to rest, there is nothing more to explain, only something to recognize, that not everything is meant to be understood completely, that some things exist simply to remind us that there is more than what we see, more than what we know, more than what we can prove. Margaret exists in that space, between what is known and what is not, between what is recorded and what is real. And that is where she remains, not fading, not changing, not ending, just existing. And once something exists in that way, it becomes part of everything. Part of how you see, part of how you think, part of how you understand the world. That is the true ending, not a conclusion, but a continuation, a quiet, endless continuation. And as you sit with it, as you think about it, as you carry it with you, one thing becomes clear. This story is not behind you. It is with you, and it will stay in the silence, in the stillness, in the moments when something feels just slightly different. And when that moment comes, you will remember that not everything is meant to be explained. Some things are simply meant to be experienced. And once they are, they never truly leave. And even now, after everything has unfolded, there is still one last quiet realization that remains. Because this story does not end when the telling stops. It continues in the space it leaves behind. A space that feels slightly different from before. Slightly more open. Slightly less certain, and that difference is where its true meaning lives. What happened in that old house in South Carolina was never about proving something. It was about revealing something. That there are parts of reality that do not follow the rules we expect. Parts that exist without needing to be explained. Parts that remain even when everything else suggests they should not. Margaret is one of those parts, not because of what she did, but because of what she represents. A presence that does not depend on time. A reality that does not depend on records. An existence that does not need confirmation to be real. And once that idea settles, even slightly, it changes something inside you. Because it removes the certainty that everything must have an answer. It replaces it with something quieter. Acceptance, not of confusion, but of possibility. The possibility that not everything is meant to fit. Not everything is meant to be resolved. And not everything is meant to end in the way we expect. That is where this story rests, not in the house, not in the past, but in that possibility. A quiet, open space where understanding does not need to be complete. Where questions can exist without answers. And where presence can exist without explanation. As this final continuation fades into silence, there is nothing more to add, only something to leave with you, that the world is larger than what we can define, that time is not always as simple as it seems, and that sometimes the most real things are the ones we cannot fully understand. Margaret remains, not just in that place, but in that idea. A quiet, steady reminder that existence is not always bound by the limits we place on it. And once you have seen that, even for a moment, it stays. It becomes part of how you see everything else. That is the true ending, not a conclusion. but a shift, a subtle, lasting shift. And once that shift happens, there is no returning to what was before, only the realization that something has changed, and that it will continue to change, quietly, endlessly, and completely.